an international survey. And we really are anchored in our own experience. A lot of the behavioral finance guys talk about anchoring in terms of what you invest in and things like that. But even when we look at emerging risks, we did the survey in October last year, and the Mumbai attacks were the last week in October. We got 3 surveys that came in late after that. All the rest of them were before that. Hardly any of these talked about terrorism as one of the top risks. All 3 of these listed as one of the top 5, and one of them listed it as number 1, just because it was recent. So one of the things that we're looking at doing with our emerging risk survey is to use it as a contrarian indicator. That if people are real worried about this, boy, let's look at some other things too and make sure that those aren't falling down. Catastrophic risks, just as important. There's a company called RMS, Risk Management Solutions, I believe it is, and they put out a paper talking about the number of deaths if someone went to the top of the Sears Tower, busted out a window, and threw anthrax out in the wind. Very easy to do. I mean, it really is. I mean, I've been up fairly high, and if you had nobody checked you for a sledgehammer, somebody could take that very easily and do that. In Chicago, that's a crossroads right by the Michael Jordan statue. Some of you might know where that is a crossroads of all the train tracks in America. A lot of fertilizer, a lot of liquid nitrogen, things like that. Other things that are flammable and disastrous. New York City, a lot of people talk about how easy it would be to poison the water just north of New York City in the Hudson. Natural, some of them aren't terrorism. The California levees, people would say that the only thing you know about levees is that eventually they'll fail because they're not kept up well enough. And so eventually, if those levees up in Sacramento fail, it'll flood San Francisco, and then San Francisco will have no water at the same time. The New Madrid Fault, anybody familiar with that? That's near St. Louis. It goes off, I think the last time it went off was early 1800s. Goes off about every 200 years. The last time when it went off in 1600, there was a population of American Indians in that area in the millions. And within 2 years after it hit, there was nobody there. So it'll be interesting to see how St. Louis makes through that. I just watched something recently about New York City and the fault lines underneath New York City. There's a lot of things out there, hurricanes. One of the things that Ken Sang asked me to talk about, and I think you can go back to the emerging risk slide and look too, is that you guys are looking for research projects. How many people are looking for research projects? Anybody? Okay, a few. These are a few that I came up with just based on things that I've talked about here. You could look at different emerging risks and how they would combine to cause an even, a synergy that would cause even greater havoc than each one by themselves. That kind of ties in with correlations. So a huge issue in the financial services industry is correlations and how those correlations change across circumstances. And there's a lot of projects out there that would, I think, have some funding capabilities. Operational risk modeling, that's a big one as well because we've been slow to get started on it. And there's just not enough data points. It's a huge problem. Risk appetite. Within the financial services industry, we worry about how much risk a company should take. And if somebody can figure out some type of formula that answers that question, that would be really helpful. With that, I have just a couple minutes left, but I do want to offer you guys the opportunity to ask some questions. Mary, are you going to go around with the microphone, or I'm not sure. Scott, is that how we want to do this? So Vanna will be up directly.
Could you possibly comment on a region such as Japan that has huge risk in terms of not just natural disasters like the sarin gas attack and earthquakes galore and volcanoes, but could you see where their future is, like where they don't have like any immigration, which I think is like North America's saving grace, but they have like probably one of the most aging or the oldest society in the world. They have challenges and possible solutions that we can sort of glean from them.
Well, I don't know as I have specific solutions, but I do know that cultures, just like regulations and everything else, revert to the mean. That Japan has had a financial regulatory structure since World War II that has worked for a while, worked very well for a while, and then didn't work very well for a while. And I'm sure that they will adjust over time to make it work better. I know, today, because of what they went through over the last 10 years, that's impacted, how Europe and the United States have reacted to what's going on now, trying not to make those same mistakes. Now, hopefully, Japan will be able to learn from what's happening here. The aging population, at some point, they're going to have to open their borders. I don't see how they can avoid that. But if these solutions were easy, somebody would have come up with them a long time ago. There's a lot of people that would be very against opening the borders, and even in the United States, that's a big issue. And there's different, two sides to every story. So sorry, I'd be happy to, if you hire me, I'm happy to share more ideas. Come back in a couple of years.
Any other quick questions?
One of the risks you mentioned earlier is the tail risk, and I'm just wondering, in your experience, is banks, after the crisis, are they become more aware of it, or is banks doing something about this? I know, I'm sort of coming at traditionally they've been looking at value at risk, for example. Interest company, we are sort of trying to look at CTE, for example.
Right.
So just wondering, if banks are beginning to realize that, or something has been, been done to these funds.
I know when I was involved with the American Academy of Actuaries when we started looking at principle-based approaches, and one of the first things we recognized was that VAR had some shortcomings that CTE maybe would be able to get us past and be a better metric, and so we worked towards CTE. I've been a little bit surprised that we haven't heard more anti-VAR discussion from the banks, and I'm actually a little bit disappointed that they seem to be trying to go back to business as usual, much more so than I hoped they would. My hope is that perhaps, if we end up with, in the U.S., a single federal regulator, much like you have in Canada, that we'd be able to be a little bit more consistent with that. But yeah, I've been disappointed so far in the bank's response.
Do you have any questions from the web participants? No. Any other questions?
So, say you had identified 5 to 10 key risks and you're trying to prioritize them. Would you try and analyze them all at once, like build one big model, or would you sort of build simpler models looking at them in isolation to try and judge which one was bigger?
Well, the first thing I would do is I wouldn't try to look at it quantitatively to start. I would look at my risks qualitatively and say, okay, on a scale from 1 to 10, what's my frequency? And then on a scale of 1 to 10, what's my severity? So kind of a probability and likelihood standpoint. And then I kind of like taking frequency plus 2 times severity. Other people do different things. And then that kind of gets you a graph that you can start to look at when you're prioritizing your risks. And then you can pick which ones, because you can't build a quantitative model for all, even your top 50. You need to pick the ones that you can do. And your operational risks are going to be harder to build models for anyhow. So I like to rank things almost more qualitatively than quantitatively. And then as I go through and build more quantitative models, I can either confirm what I thought or then adjust it. So it's one of the things I like to say is that ERM is a process, not a project. It's not a one-time thing. It's something that's going to evolve and get better each time you do it.
How do you combine this, though, when you're doing that? You don't do this one at a time, or you do it one at a time and then you start looking at two at a time?
I start off looking at them one at a time, and if it doesn't make the top 30 one at a time, it's probably not going to make the top 30 two at a time. And I know there's a couple of papers out there now looking at ways of using interconnections to prioritize those risks, but again, they're doing it very much qualitatively as opposed to quantitatively. Another research project, maybe.
Any more questions?